Hey guys, Vice Pair bringing you this Dragonflight Unholy Advanced Raid Rotation Guide. Today we're really taking a deep dive into the concept of the Unholy DK, discussing everything you need to know to do the absolute maximum amount of damage in a raiding environment. This will focus heavily on your single target rotation, discussing every little piece of min-max you can do in there, but also cover what you do whenever there's Cleave in the raid. We're going to talk about the opener, and then also discuss the cooldowns. To start off, if you haven't played Unholy before and want a bit more beginner friendly guide, I have made a Unholy beginner guide you can have a look at, which will explain the basic concepts. And I will assume you do understand the basic rotation in this video. Still, just to very quickly recap, for the single target rotation, you build wounds with Festermight Strike, you burst them with Scourge Strike, you use Death Call to spend your Runic power and your Sudden Doom procs, and then you keep up your Virulent Plague with Outbreak or Unholy Blight. That's kind of like the framework we have. Now, I think we should mention one important aspect here, which is the priority of runes versus Runic power. Essentially, if you have more than 3 runes available to you, you're overcapping on runes because you're not recharging the maximum amount. In the same way, if you go above 100 Runic power, you're wasting Runic power and overcapping on it, which is not ideal either. However, we have to make a choice here because one of those things are going to happen and you need to decide which ones you're going to prioritize. The answer is quite simple. You prioritize spending Runic power in pretty much every single instance. Avoid overcapping Runic power. Okay? You will overcap in your opener, and when you pop your cooldowns, that's fine. But in your general rotation, avoid overcapping Runic power. Now, let's talk about the advanced parts that go into this. And there's a couple of things here that we need to cover. First of all, we have multiple maintenance buffs that you need to track. You can see that I tracked them here with my weak auras, and ideally keep as much uptime on as possible. We have Death Rot, which is a debuff on the enemy, is refreshed whenever you use Epidemic or Death Call. This has a 10-second duration and you ideally should not drop it. I'm a bit of a noob in the video, I will drop it like once, but this really shouldn't drop ever. Even when you use the cooldowns, you know, throwing a single Death Call to keep it up is worthwhile. We have Icy Talons. This is a much shorter buff, also triggered by Death Call and Epidemic. Ideally, you want to keep this up as much as possible. It will drop during your cooldown windows, and that's fine. But outside of your cooldown windows, you ideally play around it by weaving in Death Calls regularly in rotation. This essentially means that you shouldn't, be hitting Scourge Strike 5 times in a row. Like, you should hit Scourge Strike twice and then Death Call once. This will be much easier to keep up once you get more haste. You can see in the video I have like 8% haste with my recent gear for Mythic Zeros, which is really a low amount. When you get to 20% above that, it's going to be much easier. So at the start, it's probably going to feel difficult to maintain it, but more easy towards when you get more gear. Finally, we have Plaguebringer. This is a disease buff, which triggers from Scourge Strike. This is very important to keep up if you run it with like a disease build. In the raid build that I will recommend, we don't run Plaguebringer actually, so you don't need to care about it. But on specific bosses, if you want to pick up the disease build that runs Super Strain, Ebon Fever, this is like your primary buff to keep up, right? You will Scourge Strike with 0 wounds to the target to keep this up. It is the highest priority. It's quite hectic. You need to weave in those Scourge Strike often. It provides downward pressure on your wound count. It feels a bit difficult to play with, but it's very high priority because it's such a big part of your damage. Cool, so that's the maintenance buffs. That's like what you need to pay attention to primarily in your rotation to keep up. Let's talk about the wound floor. The wound floor is essentially how many wounds should you Scourge Strike down to before you Festering Strike up again, yeah? I will actually get into this with Festermight because that ruins everything, but as a default, the number should be 2. Right, so Scourge Strike down to 2 and then Festering Strike. The reason we stay at 2 is 1, if you Festering Strike and get 3, and then you get a proc of Ice Infected Claws, it takes you to 6, right? Which means you don't overcap. If you Festering Strike at 3, you risk getting a 3+1 into 7, which will overcap. That's where we start at 2, yeah? The reason we don't want to go further down is because we want to set up for our Apocalypse windows. This isn't as important in Dragonflight as it has been in previous expansions because we have a lot of resources available to us. Still, you don't want to sit at 0 wounds and Apocalypse off cooldown and you kind of don't have the runes available to go up to 4, right? It's better if you start at 2. A single Festering Strike gives you enough to use Apocalypse, which is just easier when you deal with the rotation. Cool. Let's talk about Virulent Plague uptime. So this should be kept up at all times. For the normal single target build, like this is just pressing Outbreak. You can obviously press it when there's still some duration of Virulent Plague because it pandemics, which means that any remaining duration gets added to the new dot up to 30% of the duration. This means that you can reapply Virulent Plague when there's up to, I think it's 10 seconds left on the dot. So there's quite a lot of room there to press Outbreak and not lose any uptime. Still, you will see in the video, I managed to do this still. Make sure you have a good week or to keep track of it and press Outbreak when you need to. But if you're running a build that uses Unholy Blight, it gets a bit different. Unholy Blight, it provides a disease which is effectively like 40-second duration. You get those 6 seconds at the start and then you kind of pandemics on itself, which means that it's a very long duration. And what you need to do if you have Unholy Blight is you press Unholy Blight and you need to press Outbreak a single time before your next Unholy Blight. And the space of pressing that in between Outbreak is very large. Essentially, you can do it anytime between 10 seconds after you use Unholy Blight and towards the dots running out. You can essentially press it whenever, just don't press it immediately after Unholy Blight, that won't work. Wait a little bit and then do it whenever. And it's going to bridge that gap until you use your next Unholy Blight, so you get 100% off time. Cool. Now, let's talk about, I think, the most complicated minigame in our rotation, which is based on the Festermight buff. This is something that we will pick up in raiding. It's very powerful and it is an upgrade to play around properly. To understand it, every time we press Scourge Strike and pop a Fustian rune, it gives you 1 stack of the buff, which gives you a strength increase for 20 seconds. Importantly, once you start the buff will always have a 20-second duration. The duration is not refreshed whenever you increase the stack of the buff, right? This essentially means that during its 20-second duration, you're generally going to start to have low stacks and go up higher and higher, and then it finishes, it drops back down, right? You drop the buff, and then you start it again, right? And you initiate that window. The goal here is to maximize the number of stack times the duration of those stacks, which means that at the start of the window, we want to build a lot of stacks, right? At the end of it, we want to prepare for the next window. That's the idea. The most efficient way of doing it is essentially to use Apocalypse at the start of every second window. This is how it's going to play out. The first window, you set up so you have 4 Festering Wounds, you press Apocalypse, instantly get 4 stacks, and then you do normal rotation. And then towards the end of that window, right, you're going to build up Festering Runes to prepare for the next one, and you're going to dump your Runic power to make sure you have lots of runes available. If you pay attention to my rotation, you'll see I do this actively. So at the start of the window, I try to burst as many wounds as possible, and then towards the end, I try to build the wounds up again, right, and dump Runic power to prepare for the next one. There's another set of complexity here. So Apocalypse has a 45-second cooldown, which means that if you immediately trigger your Festermight windows, they're going to come every 20 seconds, which means that the second one comes at the 40-second mark, which is 5 seconds before Apocalypse. We don't want that. Essentially, you can be pretty chill with initiating your second window. First one initiates by Apocalypse, yeah. The second one, you can sit there and wait for a couple seconds, dump your Runic power, don't be too hasty with building up your wounds there. The preparation can happen afterwards, because what essentially that means is that your windows align much better with your Apocalypse. I know it's probably, it's a tricky one. It's quite a new thing to play around, but as I said, it's a significant upgrade, And I feel like once you kind of get into the ebb and flow of your stacks and how you kind of delay your next window, it's going to flow quite nicely. Absolute priority is once you enter the window, you want to go low on Festering Rune stacks, build up the Festermight stacks. Towards the end of the window, dump your Runic power, build up wounds for the next one, and delay the next one so that it aligns with Apocalypse. It's bad if you mess this up, because what essentially happens is that when you end up with your 1.5 minute cooldown window and then your 3 minute one, if your Festermight is misaligned, it's not going to do well for your cooldowns, because it's very important to align your Festermight window with your cooldowns, because it's a significant DPS upgrade. Anyway, enough of that. I'm going to discuss it a little bit more when we talk about the opener and so on, but that's the general idea of Festermight. Now, the final thing I want to discuss is how to do Cleave in a raiding environment. The essential part here is dealing with Death and Decay and making sure you apply your diseases. That's pretty much it. If you're on a boss where there's going to be a lot of Cleave, you're most likely going to run Ebon Fever because it's very powerful on Cleave. The whole idea is whenever any ads spawn, you want to hit Outbreak or Unholy to dot them up ASAP, and then you press Scourge Strike to make sure your Plaguebringer buff is up, and that's the majority of damage right there. Alright, having a dot up and Plaguebringer buff is going to do a ton of damage. To do the actual Cleave, you puff down your Death and Decay, and then you spam Scourge Strike. And you don't care that much about having your Festering Wounds on the targets. That's pretty much it. If you have like stack Cleave for a long period of time, what you ideally would do is that you stack up lots of Festering Wounds on all the targets. You can do that with Dark Transformation passively, and then you tap your Festering Strikes. You puff down your Death and Decay, and then use Cleave everything with Scourge Strike, and you ideally time that with your Festermight window, right? So since you have lots of wounds stacked up, every Scourge Strike hits everything, you're going to get 4 stacks of Festermight every hit. It's going to do lots of Cleave damage, and it's just going to empower yourself. So kind of ideal scenario, you would set up this Cleave burst window by putting up Festering Strike and Festering Wounds and multiple mobs. You time your burst window with your Festermight, and you make sure your Plaguebringer is up. I think that's pretty much it. Also, if it's a lot of ads, you're obviously going to start spending rune power with Epidemic. This happens whenever there's 4+ mobs. So if 3 or less, you hit Death Cold, spend your rune power. If there's more than 4, you're going to start spamming Epidemic. And we're quite good at this. Like if there's a big pack of mobs spawning, if we save up some runic power, you hit Outbreak, Scourge Strike, keep up the Plaguebringer, and then just spam Epidemic. That's going to do a ton of damage for you. Alright, now let's move on to the opener here. And I got it up here. And this might look a bit weird when you first consider it. First of all, Dark Transformation comes before Apocalypse. You might think, hang on, Dark Transformation, I'm running Command of the Dead. Surely it should be after Apocalypse. Luckily for us, they put in this kind of weird, like 3 or 4 second grace period, where if you use Apocalypse after Dark Transformation, the ghouls still get buffed. I think it's due to, like, if you press Army and then press Dark Transformation immediately afterwards, if you didn't get the grace period, like the ghouls that were summoned wouldn't get the buff, which would be a bit silly. You would imagine, press Army and then Dark Transformation to buff the ghouls, and they put in the grace period to avoid any confusion there. Generally, the idea here is to build up the runic power, pop down your Dark Arbiter, pop every single cooldown you have, and then just spam away your death calls to buff up your gargle. That's it. This is kind of like the most efficient way of doing that. You have a couple of death calls sprinkled in there to get some early buffs on the Dark Arbiter. If you get some Sudden Doom procs, you're going to overcap and runic power, but that's fine. Still just follow this exact rotation every time. It's going to be the most optimal. We used Unholy Assault quite late. You might think they want to use that early to set up for Apocalypse, but overall using it late means that we get a bigger burst window for Dark Arbiter, which means that we benefit more from things like Power Infusion, which is something you should be asking for because that is incredibly powerful for us. It's like a 10% DPS upgrade overall. Very good. Cool. Follow that. You're going to do lots of good DPS. All good. Now let's talk about all our cooldowns, because I feel like that's going to be an important aspect. For instance, we haven't discussed how we deal with Dark Arbiter and the priority there. That's going to be a topic here. First of all, though, let's talk about cooldown timings, because this is what you're going to be caring about in a raid environment. Our cooldowns come in a 45-second timer. So every 45 seconds, we're going to press some cooldowns, and essentially we're going to press every cooldown that's available to us. We can spec into cooldown reduction, that kind of thing, which means that everything nicely aligns for us. So we get some semi-good 45-second cooldown windows, quite powerful 1.5-minute ones, and really powerful 3-minute cooldown windows. Here's a sample kind of sequence on how it will look like. So under opener, we use everything. We want to get it out. Just do lots of damage, synergize very well with Bloodlust Openers, our Trinket, that kind of thing. Great. 45 seconds later, we use Unholy Blight, Dark Transformation, and Apocalypse. If you don't click Blight, just ignore that, right? 45 seconds after that, we're going to use the same combo, but we add in Unholy Assault. We're going to get this Abomination Limb usage at 2 minutes. It doesn't really synergize with everything, so just use it or save it for some ads to get some nice pad and help group up ads, you know. At 2 minute 15, sorry, just Blight and Apocalypse again. And then at 3 minutes, we've saved our Empower Rune weapon to use Blight Transformation, Apocalypse, Army, Gargle, Unholy Assault, and Empower Rune weapon. Everything. It's essentially like the opener, but without the Abomination Limb. The order here, it's important to use Army first, but after that point, using Summon Gargle, Apocalypse, and then Dark Transformation afterwards. The order there doesn't matter that much, but you want to use Unholy Assault and Empower Rune weapon kind of last. So after you got everything up and running, that's when you use Unholy Assault and Empower Rune weapon, increase your haste, and then just does lots of damage. Now, some important aspects of these cooldowns. Obviously, the Apocalypse should always be used at 4 wounds. I think that important to say it. Don't use it at 3, 2, or 1. Always use it at 4. Make sure to set up those 4 wounds. And Unholy Assault should be used generally after Apocalypse. Buff the haste of those minions. Helps with your Festermight windows to get those extra wounds to then burst down. Dark Transformation, you don't really play around that one. You have Unholy Pact, but it has loads of area. You want to hit Death Call, but you do that in the rotation anyway to increase its duration, so not much to do there. Gargle, important. You want to make sure you start out with 50 Runic power, so when you press it, so you go up to max. And once you pressed it, essentially you press Death Call as your highest priority. So usually you press Death Call to avoid overcapping, right? But with Gargle, you just press Death Call whenever you can to keep buffing it. Still, you shouldn't ignore your maintenance buffs and everything, but still, it's very distinct. When Gargle's up, Death Call becomes much higher priority. Empower Rune weapon, as I said, we just save it for Gargle, make sure we buff it. Finally, I feel like I should mention Soul Reaper, which is a talent we do pick up sometimes. We want to use this whenever the boss is below 35% health, whenever possible. It deals a ton of damage when it explodes with that execute damage. If you want to min-max it, you should use it a couple of seconds before the boss hits 35% health, so maybe 37, 36. That's when you hit your third Soul Reaper. It means that it's going to trigger as soon as boss hits 35% health, and essentially gives you an extra run in the fight. Cool. That was everything I had for you guys. I hope that was comprehensive. I hope it helps you improve your gameplay as Unholy Death Knight, find those min-maxy bits, and just deal more damage overall. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you thought about this video. Upvote, downvote, consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.